Most people think wealth begins with $1 million. I have never believed that. $1 million is a scoreboard number. It is the number people imagine when they want to feel big. It is a headline number. It is a dinner party number. It is the kind of number that flatters the ego before it improves the life. But if you want to understand the point where money begins to change human behavior in a durable way, you have to stop looking at the number that sounds glamorous and start looking at the number that changes how a person thinks on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. For a great many people, that number is not 1 million. It is not even 100,000. It is 20,000. That sounds almost insulting in an age when every screen is filled with people talking about 7 figures, private jets, luxury watches, and passive income fantasies. 20,000 does not sound rich. It does not look rich. It does not impress anybody. Nobody posts a triumphant photograph because their savings account crossed 20,000. But I have spent enough time watching how people behave around money to know that this is often the first sum that moves a person from financial panic into financial choice. That is an entirely different universe. I want you to think about the ordinary sensation of checking your bank account. I do not mean the ceremonial review people perform when they are already comfortable. I mean the lived experience, the one where your pulse rises a little before the screen loads, the one where your mind begins doing arithmetic before the number is even visible. Can I buy groceries this week? Can I pay rent and still cover the utility bill? Can I say yes if the car makes a strange noise tomorrow? Can I afford to replace the laptop if it dies? Can I buy a coffee without feeling like I have betrayed my future? A life built on questions like that is not a life built on calculation. It is a life built on siege when a person has no cushion. Every decision is infected by fear. They call it budgeting. They call it discipline. They call it being realistic. But much of the time it is simply survival mode with a respectable name attached to it. The mind narrows, the time horizon collapses. The person starts reacting instead of deciding. They take the job they do not want because they cannot wait. They stay in the apartment they hate because moving feels dangerous. They keep the toxic boss because the next paycheck matters more than self-respect. They say yes to bad terms and bad timing and bad deals because they do not have the one thing that lets a person pause, breathing room. That is why I take the $20,000 threshold seriously. People imagine money changes life because bigger balances produce bigger returns. That is true, but it is the less interesting part of the story. The more powerful change happens before the spreadsheet. It happens in the nervous system. It happens in the imagination. It happens when the brain finally stops asking how to survive until next Friday and starts asking what kind of life is worth building over the next 10 years. That is a revolutionary shift. A man with no cushion does not think like an investor, even if he opens a brokerage account. He thinks like prey. He thinks about exposure. He thinks about avoiding embarrassment. He thinks about getting through the month without humiliation. He is not stupid. He is constrained. It is hard to think about growth when every unexpected expense feels like a personal ambush. I have watched this pattern for years. The people who appear bad with money are often not bad with arithmetic. They are simply trapped in an environment where every decision is short-term because the consequences of being wrong are immediate. If the margin is too thin, prudence becomes panic. That is why the first threshold matters so much. It gives the mind a little distance from the fire. The source document made this point in a language that I think deserves to be preserved. It argued that people with no savings live in survival mode, while people who cross that first meaningful reserve begin to move from reacting to growing. It also pointed to a Vanguard finding that even $2,000 in emergency savings materially improves financial well-being, and that pushing the reserve toward 3 to 6 months of living expenses, which for many households lands around $20,000, creates another substantial jump in financial well-being. Faithful Site Fay turn 18 file 6 Fay that is believable to me because it matches what common sense tells you. $2,000 can stop a blown tire or an urgent flight or a medical bill from becoming a catastrophe. But $20,000 changes more than a week. It changes posture. It changes the way a person walks into the world. It creates enough room for thought. Not luxury, not indulgence. Thought there is another reason this threshold matters, and this one is mathematical. Imagine a person saving $19,000 a month and earning 8% on invested money. The first $20,000 takes time. The source document uses roughly 19 months, and that feels right as a picture, even if a real-life path will vary a bit by timing and returns. It feels slow because almost all the heavy lifting is still human effort. The second $20,000 comes a little faster because now the first pile of money has started helping. The document frames that second $20,000 as arriving in about 17 months rather than 19, and then keeps pushing the idea further until the point becomes impossible to miss. Once the invested base is large enough, money begins doing more of the work that once had to be done by labor and patience alone. By the time an investor reaches $400,000, the document argues, the next $20,000 can be generated in a matter of months rather than years Fay Felicite, Fay Turn 18, File 6, Fay Turn 18, File 2, Fay. This is not magic. It is not a secret society. It is not a private club. It is arithmetic. When a person has $1,000 invested and earns 10%, the gain is noticeable but not life. Changing when the person has $20,000 and earns the same rate, the gain becomes emotionally meaningful. The investment strategy did not become smarter. The person did not discover a hidden asset class. The same broad principles are available. The scale changed, and the scale made the percentages matter in daily life. Fay Felicite, Fay Turn 18, File 2, Fay. That is a lesson most people absorb too late. They think wealth is built by finding the perfect stock, the perfect side hustle, the perfect tax trick, the perfect shortcut. In reality, wealth is often built by crossing a threshold where the machine finally begins to assist the operator. The first engine is behavior. The second engine is capital. The mistake is trying to skip the first and jump directly to the second. I have no interest in telling you that $20,000 makes you rich. It does not. It does something more important than that. It proves that you can stop consuming every dollar that touches your hands. It proves that you can restrain impulse. It proves that you can endure delayed gratification for long enough to alter your future. It proves that money is no longer just something that arrives and vanishes. It proves that you can build a reserve, defend it, and let it become productive. That is not a number. That is an identity shift. If you begin from zero and reach 20,000, honestly, you did not get there by accident. Unless you were handed an unusual stroke of luck, you had to say no many times while others were saying yes. You had to look at small temptations and keep walking. You had to track where the cash was leaking. You had to notice what sort of purchases made you feel better for 10 minutes and worse for 10 months. You had to learn that discipline is not a dramatic act. It is a repeated refusal to make yourself weaker in exchange for temporary relief. Once a person has done that long enough to accumulate 20,000, the person is no longer the same creature who began the process that matters, because future decisions are made by the current self, not by the self that made all the earlier mistakes. If you have taught yourself to save 20,000, you have already rehearsed the core act at the heart of compounding, giving up a smaller present pleasure for a larger future freedom. People dismiss this as motivational language. I do not. I think it is mechanical language. Habits are machinery. Identity is machinery. A person who has proved he can save is operating with better machinery than a person who is still telling himself he will become disciplined someday. This is where the story gets more interesting. Once the reserve is in place, the world stops looking like a map of threats and starts looking like a field of options. That change is easy to miss if you have never lived without it. But it is one of the biggest differences between people who merely earn and people who steadily build. Suppose the car breaks down. If you have nothing, the event is not merely inconvenient. It becomes a chain reaction. You miss work, you borrow at bad terms, you use the credit card again, you pay interest on desperation. One small event acquires a second and a third penalty. But if you have 20,000, the same event is irritating and expensive without being structurally destabilizing. That difference is enormous. It means inconvenience no longer becomes collapse. The same is true of opportunity. If a friend mentions a business idea and wants a small amount of seed capital, the broke person cannot even evaluate the idea. Honestly, the answer is predetermined by the absence of spare capital. If a conference could improve your career but the company will not pay, you cannot ask whether the trip is worth it. The answer is blocked by cash scarcity. If a better apartment, a relocation, a short course, or a stretch job requires a few $1,000s and a few months of tolerance for uncertainty, the person with no cushion cannot run the numbers in any real sense. The person with a reserve can. The reserve does not guarantee good judgment, but it creates the possibility of judgment. The source document captured this cleanly when it said money goes to money, not because of cosmic favoritism, but because having money gives people options. And options create opportunities to make more money. Fay Felicite, Fay Turn 18, File 5, Fay. I have found that to be one of the least mystical and most useful truths in finance. What people call luck is often optionality wearing a disguise. If you can act when the window opens, you appear lucky to those who could only watch. If you can endure 6 months of uncertainty while pursuing something better, you appear brave to those who were never in a position to take the risk. But much of what is described as courage is merely reserve capital meeting preparation. That is why I am less interested in tiny daily economies than in structural decisions. When a person is broke, he obsesses over small choices because small choices are the only ones he feels he can control. Brand name cereal or generic homemade coffee or a $3 purchase, premium gasoline or regular. Those choices matter at the margin, and I do not despise the margin, but the margin is not where great fortunes are usually made or lost. The source document makes this point well. Once the foundation exists, the mind shifts away from microscopic purchases and toward the large recurring decisions that determine long-term wealth: where you live, what you drive, how much you save, where you invest, and what fixed obligations you carry. Fay file site Fay turn 18 file 5 Fay I would go even further. A person can ruin himself while boasting about saving on coffee. He can haggle over tiny expenses and then sign a terrible lease, buy too much house, finance a depreciating vehicle, carry a lifestyle designed to impress people who are not paying his bills, and undo 10 years of small discipline with 3 grand gestures of vanity. I have seen people live like this. Their budget is tight, their image is polished, and their net worth is a rumor. 20,000 changes the conversation because it introduces the idea of opportunity cost in a way the body can actually feel. Before that threshold, a car payment is usually judged by one question: can I make the monthly payment? After that threshold, a better question becomes available. What is this purchase stealing from me over the next 10 or 20 years? That is a richer question. It is a more adult question. It is a more honest question. It pulls the mind out of installment thinking and into ownership thinking. The source material used the car example because it is vivid and because it hurts. It argued that many people spend $600 to $800 a month over decades on transportation, and that the lifetime cost can easily run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. It also made the painfully simple point that a new car loses about 20% of its value the moment it leaves the lot, while the same money invested in productive assets has the potential to multiply instead of shrink. Then it drove the knife deeper by saying that a $30,000 car is not just a $30,000 car. It is also the future value that money might have reached had it been allowed to compound, which the document framed as more than $200,000 over 20 years. In one illustration, Fay file a site Fay turn 18 file 1 Fay turn 18 file 0 Fay. That is the kind of arithmetic people do not like because it makes desire look expensive. And desire is expensive not because wanting things is immoral, but because every major purchase silently crowds out another future. A bigger apartment is never just a bigger apartment. It may also be 5 more years before independence. A luxurious vacation is never just a week away. It may also be the lost seed of a later opportunity. A hobby purchased for status rather than joy is never just a hobby. It is rent paid to insecurity. I do not mean that life should be reduced to a spreadsheet. I have never admired joyless misers. I have also never admired people who confuse spending with self-respect. The point is not to squeeze every delight out of life. The point is to know what you are trading. That phrase has saved people a great deal of pain when they are willing to use it. Know what you are trading. You are not trading a few $100s for a car upgrade. You may be trading several years of optionality. You are not trading a larger housing payment for granite countertops and extra square footage. You may be trading the right to take a better job later, the ability to absorb a downturn, the chance to invest aggressively when fear brings bargains into view. You are not trading a flashy lifestyle for admiration. You may be trading calm sleep for applause from people who will forget your purchase by next month. Once a person has 20,000 and begins thinking this way, something subtle but important happens. He often discovers that he does not truly want many of the things he once chased. This is a liberation, not a sacrifice. A man who learns that he does not need the expensive imitation of success has taken a large step toward real power. He becomes harder to manipulate. He becomes less dependent on other people's standards. He becomes less likely to mortgage his future for appearances. That same threshold also changes the relationship with work. And I consider this one of the most underappreciated parts of the story. When a person lives paycheck to paycheck, he does not negotiate. He pleads. Even when the pleading is silent, he may speak confidently, but his circumstances are making decisions underneath the words. The terrible boss knows it. The mediocre employer knows it. The organization that keeps asking for more knows it. The employee may talk about loyalty or patience or stability. But frequently what is really happening is simple captivity. A reserve changes that. The source document used a phrase I like very much. It called $20,000 walking away money. That does not mean walking away recklessly. It does not mean quitting for sport or confusing freedom with immaturity. It means that for the first time, a person has a cushion large enough to imagine saying, no. He can ask for the raise he deserves because the answer is no longer tied to immediate ruin. He can push back on unfair terms. He can entertain another offer. He can devote time to interviews. He can survive while searching. Even if he never uses the reserve, the mere knowledge that he could use, it changes his demeanor. He becomes less frightened, more direct, more willing to carry himself like a person with agency. Fay file a site Fay turn 18 file 1 Fay. That posture itself tends to attract better treatment. The world is not always fair, but it does respond to confidence grounded in actual capacity. People notice when you are no longer negotiating from visible desperation. They hear it in your voice. They see it in what you tolerate and what you refuse. Often the reserve works long before it is spent. It becomes an invisible ally in every conversation. This is one reason I say 20,000 is not merely a financial milestone. It is a social milestone. It alters the terms on which a person meets employers, landlords, opportunities, emergencies, and even his own temptations. Which brings me to the great mistake people make after crossing the threshold. They celebrate by destroying the threshold. They save faithfully, suffer patiently, arrive at 20,000, feel stronger for the first time in years, and then treat the reserve as proof they deserve a lifestyle reward. The car gets upgraded, the vacation becomes lavish, the larger apartment suddenly feels justifiable. The person says he has earned it. In one sense he has. In the only sense that matters, he has not. What he has earned is a foundation, not a permission slip. The source document said this plainly, and I agree with it. 20,000 is not a trophy for good behavior. It is the seed of the future. Fayfelicite Fayturn 18 file. One-phase seeds are not supposed to look like forests. That is why people mishandle them. They underestimate how much life is hidden inside a small thing. I would urge anyone who reaches that first serious reserve to protect it with more seriousness than he protected the process of building it. The hardest money most people will ever save is the first meaningful pile. The second pile is aided by the first. The third pile is aided by the first two. The machine improves once it exists. But if you dig it up every time you feel deprived, you never get the compounding that was supposed to transform your life. This is where discipline ceases to look moral and starts looking strategic. Protecting the reserve does not mean worshiping the reserve. It means assigning it the correct job. The correct job is not to make you feel temporarily successful. The correct job is to alter what life can do to you and what you can do with life. That is a big distinction. I want to make one more point because people hear a message like this and sometimes twist it into joyless austerity. They imagine a gray life built around deprivation. They picture a man who never buys coffee, never travels, never enjoys dinner, never relaxes, never celebrates. That is not what I am describing. I am describing intentionality. I am describing the difference between spending in a way that serves your deepest aims and spending in a way that leaks your future without your permission. Once you understand the force of compounding, you become much more careful about what deserves a permanent claim on your cash flow. That is the real dividing line, not spending versus not spending, intentional spending versus unconscious spending, chosen obligations versus inherited ones, purchases that deepen life versus purchases that merely decorate insecurity. The $20,000 threshold matters because it is often the first point where a person can think with enough clarity to draw those distinctions consistently. That is why I would never mock the number for being too small. It is small only to people who have forgotten what financial suffocation feels like. For the person who has been living one surprise away from humiliation, 20,000 can feel like the first honest breath in years. It can mean the difference between taking the first offer and waiting for the right one. It can mean the difference between panic borrowing and calm problem solving. It can mean the difference between resenting every bill and planning for the next decade. It can mean the difference between asking, "Can I survive?" and asking, "How should I build?" That is a radical difference in the quality of a life, and if you want the uncomfortable truth, most people do not fail to become wealthy because they never discover a brilliant investment. They fail because they never cross the first threshold that gives their mind and their money a chance to cooperate. They keep resetting to zero. They keep rewarding themselves at the precise moment the machine is about to become useful. They keep treating every bit of progress as available for consumption. Then they wonder why the process never gets easier. Of course it never gets easier. They never let it. You do not have to be extraordinary to benefit from this threshold. You do not need a trust fund. You do not need elite access. You do not need a secret from wealthy families. You need a reserve large enough to interrupt survival mode, a behavior strong enough to defend it, and a mind willing to see that your largest financial victories will usually come from a few structural decisions made correctly and repeated for a long time. That is the kind of game I have always respected. Save the first pile, protect the first pile, invest the first pile. Let the first pile change the way you think before you ask it to change the way you look. A person who can do that is far closer to lasting wealth than the person who can imitate wealth on the surface. $20,000 will not make you rich overnight. It may do something better. It may put an end to the most expensive financial state a human being can live in, which is permanent desperation. It may teach you opportunity cost in a language you can feel. It may turn money from a monthly emergency into a long-term ally. It may allow you to stop living as a hostage to every short-term problem. It may even give you the one freedom from which many other freedoms quietly grow. The freedom to say no. I have seen fortunes built on less glamorous beginnings than that. In fact, most real fortunes are. The world loves the finish line because the finish line photographs well. I have always preferred the hinge point, the quiet moment where the engine finally catches. For many people, that engine does not catch at $1 million. It catches when the fear begins to loosen, when the reserve begins to stand between them and chaos, when opportunity cost becomes more real than appearances, and when work stops being a cage and starts becoming a choice. That is why I would take 20,000 seriously. Not because it sounds rich, because it changes the rules. And when the rules change in your favor, you do not need theatrics. You need patience. You need continued discipline. You need the humility not to sabotage the threshold just because you finally reached it. If you can do that, the first 20,000 will not be remembered as the amount that made you wealthy. It will be remembered as the amount that made wealth possible.